Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Junior Forum. My name is Kezia Clark and I'm a junior at the college studying history and literature, and I'm a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. The Institute of Politics is excited to be a part of this fall's Harvard Votes Challenge, a voter registration competition between Harvard schools. For more information, see the inside of your programs. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag Mastromonaco Forum, which is also listed in your program. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, Alyssa Mastromonaco and Amy Dacey.
Patty Sherns, Carrie James. Hi, old friends.
Wow, this is loud.
Hello, it is loud. I'm used to being loud without it, so this is interesting. Well, welcome everybody. There's some familiar faces. I'm so excited, Alyssa, that you came on campus. There's so much to talk about.
So much.
And we're gonna let plenty of time for people to ask questions, except anybody who ever worked with the both of us, so they're not allowed. But we're gonna have a great conversation tonight. I think it's incredible, whether we talk about you being the former president of Global Communication Strategy and Talent at A&E Networks, former COO at Vice Media. But I think what a lot of people certainly will want to talk about too is the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations.
I mean, it's
pretty exciting.
Sort of the most interesting, arguably.
It's one that a few questions might come up. But obviously, one of the big things that we're all just so proud of and so happy for you is that you're author of the New York Times bestseller, Who Thought This Was a Good Idea.
Who thought it was a good idea?
So I encourage everybody, if you have not bought that book, to buy it immediately. It's phenomenal. So Alyssa, let's start with that. The title of your book, again, is Who Thought This Was a Good Idea? So can you explain why you wanted to make that the title of your first New York Times bestseller?
My first one. Can you guys hear me? I feel like I suddenly went mute. You can hear me? Okay. There we go. So they say that when you write a book, it really helps if you have the title and an idea of what you want the cover to look like to sort of guide you. And so I actually had this really incredible photo of myself where I look like Jackie Kennedy on Marine One with Barack Obama. And they were like, no, not that one. And so who thought this was a good idea, which I have many friends here in the front row, but Patty and Seti and Carrie have all heard before, which is like you're sitting at your desk on a campaign and the phone rings, and in my case, it might have been Seti, but in others, in the White House, it was other people who worked with Seti, and they'd be with Barack Obama, and they would say the passive-aggressive, hey boss, who thought this was a good idea? And what that really means is that Barack Obama thought it was a terrible idea. He didn't want to tell me that. And so instead of understanding that I was obviously the person who thought it was a good idea, that was how people communicated that they thought that what we were doing and that my idea was not that good. But the point is that if you did think it was a good idea, you always have to be able to defend yourself, which I always did.
You did a great job. And the book it weaves throughout the book, but I think one of the things that I think is interesting is it really looks also at like you as a woman in this position of power and how you dealt with other people having so much responsibility. And I think one of the times you said that most women you know want to be likable and trustworthy.
Yeah.
But should that be the goal, or do you think that's what we should?
No, I think that when you're younger and you're proving yourself, it's hard. And so one of the things I talk about was that at the beginning of the Obama campaign, I was part of a small handful of people, and one of the men who was helping us that had sort of more experience in Iowa, I guess, than I did, thought that his word should be law and that it shouldn't be challenged. And so when I would come back with questions or I would poke holes in what he wanted to do, he would say, you better be careful or people are going to think you're a bitch. And I mean, talk about a dagger to the heart to someone who looks like Punky Brewster. I was like, a bitch? I'm not a bitch. And so I took that very personally, and I was really sad about it, and I thought about it a lot, like every day. I was like, am I being a bitch today? Am I being a bitch today? And that wasn't fair. He was the one who was wrong. I didn't have to change the way I was behaving. But mostly I think that everybody should try to be trustworthy and likable. I think that you come into a lot of job situations where people try to prove themselves, and part of proving themselves is acting like an asshole. And that's just not how I do.
Yeah, but there's also, like, for a lot of us women I know, and you talked a lot about this, is that we need to know that we're right before we kind of stand up and use our voice. It's actually a study.
So. There are a couple things that have been written about it. One is that job applications, so if there's a job posting online, a woman reads that, and if she fits 80 to 90% of the qualifications, she will apply for the job. For a man, it's less than 50%. And so that goes to, for example, when we were in the White House, and we'd be sitting at the table, and there's one example where I really got out of my comfort zone, which was, it was after the economic crisis, and we were having a meeting, and I'm in a room with, you know, Tim Geithner and Larry Summers and all the dudes, and Christy Romer, and Melody Barnes, who was the head of the Domestic Policy Council at the time, and they were all talking about food stamps. And I was sort of just like in the meeting as part of like being deputy chief of staff for operations. Nancy Ann DeParle, who was one of the architects of the Affordable Care Act, she was the deputy chief of staff for policy. We had a very clear line. And so she handled her stuff and I handled my stuff. Wait, where was I going? Oh, in the meeting, sorry, the food stamps. Sorry,
I know, it's been good. Keep going.
So sometimes I would just join meetings to learn more and understand what was happening, though I wasn't an active participant in the meetings. In college, you would call it auditing. I'd sometimes audit the meetings. And so everyone's sitting around the table, and I was sitting backbench, and all these people who had never experienced food stamps were opining on food stamps, and I was getting so antsy in my seat, and finally I was sitting like right here, and so I was sitting directly behind Barack Obama. And I do this, I always raise my hand, I still do it. I just think it's a very civilized way to interrupt. And I said, you guys, like I need to tell you, because I worked with people who used food stamps.
We'll say why.
Because I was the best checker bagger at Kilmer's IGA in Rhinebeck, New York, and it was
so all experience pays off, right?
All experience pays off. It was the only grocery store within like 30 or 40 miles that accepted food stamps. Where I grew up. And so I said to them, like, you're talking about these things, and like they didn't even understand, like taxable grocery is different than non-taxable grocery, and their eyes are just kind of glazing over. And I said, you know, so something like Sunny Delight, right? Sunny Delight you could not, at least then, buy with food stamps, even though it had all the vitamins and minerals you would actually need. You could, however, buy bottled water or other weird things that were not gonna help a woman with 2 kids trying to satisfy their nutritional needs. And so I went on this very sort of emotional talk about the food stamps and my experience growing up and what I didn't think that they were considering. And I was really red in the face by the time I was done, because I was like, I really went on too long. Like and POTUS just turned, he said, yeah, you need more of that. And I was like, oh, so there are no dumb questions ever, which women should learn more, because most of the questions, the questions that I can think of so many of them that I thought were the dumbest thing that I was going to humiliate myself by asking, ended up being like fairly pivotal. This is the 6th year? It's the 6th-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. And so part of my job in the White House was to oversee and coordinate interagency response to hurricanes and natural disasters. And so I'm sitting in a room, in the Situation Room, with all of the cabinet secretaries, and they're like, is there anything we're not thinking of, like how to communicate with people? And the one thing that you learn is that in natural disasters, the one thing that actually usually still lasts and still works is a radio. And you should always have a radio with batteries in it. And so I said, I was so nervous, and Janet Napolitano and Craig Fugate and Secretary Chu, and I was like, you know, did we do a PSA? And they're like, what? I'm like, did we record a PSA for the radio? And they were like, actually, we didn't. And so within about an hour, we had Michelle Obama record a PSA, And the PSA idea led us to get billboards in Times Square. I'm pointing like I'm still in New York. Times Square's over there. And the like television screens in hotels where people would be with all the information that they could use. And so the one thing that I felt really self-conscious about saying out loud and really had to think about whether I would say it ended up really helping a lot of people, whereas like most men in the room, had they had the idea, would have like vomited it out like 20 minutes before that. Like they wouldn't have like had a conversation with themselves about whether or not they should share a very basic idea.
So obviously sharing knowledge is important, but you've said before that preparation is protection you can create for yourself.
Yeah.
So you feel strongly like if you're prepared, you're successful. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure.
So
I'm like not like by nature of the jobs I have ended up in, I'm not a fly by the seat of my pants kind of person. I also, if you've read my book, know that I suffer from IBS, which can be triggered by stress and anxiety. And so it's like, how do I get through the day? Well, the way I get through the day is by being prepared. And so when I first, one of the better examples, which kind of cuts both ways, is that when I became deputy chief of staff, I found out that, well, I knew at the time, but the White House Military Office reports to the Deputy Chief for Operation, which is 3,500 members of the military who run Camp David, Air Force One, Marine One, the campus of the White House, basically everything, Joint Base Andrews, everything you could imagine. And I had to go to a meeting, my first meeting. And I come in that day, and I had not thought about it before I left the house, and I literally had a shirt that looked like Care Bears on. And the thing to know is that the deputy chief has the rank of a 3-star general. So you had 2-star generals who would have to salute me, and I was like, you can really stop that right now. Don't have to do that anymore. And so I was very nervous because I knew that I was very young. You know, more than anything I've talked about, I felt more self-conscious about my age in the White House than my gender.
Because you are the youngest woman.
I was the youngest deputy chief. I was the first woman to ever occupy the office next to the Oval.
That's pretty impressive. Yes.
Former occupants, George Stephanopoulos, Karl Rove, James Carville, David Plouffe, David Axelrod, et cetera, et cetera.
Did you ever find anything in the drawers? Like
no, except they'd always had the same desk. And so when I got in there, my feet didn't touch the ground. And I was like, you guys, like, this is embarrassing. Can we get like a shorter, can we like cut the bottoms? They're like, no, this desk has been here for 100 years. We're not chopping the bottom off for you. So I had like a little stool like that I put my feet on, which was really impressive. But no, and like when you talk about people helping people, when David Plouffe, who some of you I'm sure know and have come to see speak, when Plouffe left the White House, one of the things he said to the president was that he wanted to make sure I took his office. And so, yeah, I know, right? So, so that was, I hadn't thought about that in a while. It was very special, actually. So yeah.
Well, you've talked about your knowledge, your preparedness, but there's also the conviction of your ideas.
Oh, wait, hold on. I didn't finish my thought. I'm very sorry. I've had a cold, and so it's just like all coming back to me. So the point was that when I went down to the military office, I had spent 2 days reading 2 binders that were this thick. I had gone through and I had tabbed the things I didn't understand, which I intended to pretend to understand in the meeting. And so we get into this room, which is in one of the places they don't talk about in the White House. And I get into the room and they all stand up and they salute. And I was like, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. And I sit at the head of the table. I was like, this is so uncomfortable. And instead of pretending, which is part of being prepared, instead of pretending that I understood everything, I actually paid them the respect they deserved, and I asked them to explain things to me, which was the best way for me to learn, but also a way for them to understand that we were all part of the team. I wasn't some snot nose. I mean, like, you have to understand, and Seti knows when he was in the Clinton administration, like, there is a certain expectation of how old you will be and what you will look like if you work in the West Wing, and we did not in many ways fit that. I mean, I think we were probably close to the youngest group of people that had come in. Jon Favreau, me, Dan Pfeiffer. I mean, it was like the inmates were running the asylum. And so to me, that's how I gained their trust, because they knew that if I made a decision, it was never going to be uninformed. And that if I knew what to do, I was going to do it. But if I didn't, I would always ask the questions. And so there were a lot of times when, you get into the groove of things. Yeah. We were in, do you guys remember the Icelandic volcano that erupted and there was that plume that traveled the world? Well, when you are reliant on a plane, it's a real problem because that plume melts the engines. So if you are flying, you need to make sure that you are nowhere near the plume. So we were in Indonesia, and I guess I was acting chief of staff on the trip, and we find out that the plume is within dangerous proximity of the Jakarta airport. And Obama and Secretary Clinton were in like a bilateral meeting, and so it was literally on me. And I was like, we have to, and so the Chinese knew that the plume was coming too. So the Chinese start to pull their plane out, and Colonel Turner, who was the Air Force One pilot, who was like, as Barack Obama said, he was exactly what you want your pilot to look like. I mean, he had like this buzz cut, and he was like ruggedly handsome, and like, he'd like flirt a little bit, but not in a Me Too kind of way. And and so I was like, we had to make a decision. If we didn't pull the plane out, we were going to be stuck there for days. And so I was like, screw the Chinese, pull the plane out. And they were like, what? I'm like, do it. And Colonel Turner was like, that's my girl. And so we jumped the Chinese in line, and we raced Obama to the airport, and we got out. Well, because the Chinese were going the other direction. Like, they were going to be fine. And so, but there were things that if I had not built that relationship and that level of trust, and that they would have been like, sorry, lady, we're going to wait for POTUS to get out of his bilat. And so through the course of time, I had to make a lot of decisions like that. That's just the most fun.
But it's important to make those decisions with a conviction. And
yeah.
I mean, but you learned early, you mentioned there was a Girl Scout incident early on where you learned about failure.
So I was a shitty Girl Scout. So my parents were not of the coddling variety, and so when it was time to sell Girl Scout cookies, because I was a brownie, all the girls in my dance class brought their sheet to dance class to try to sell their cookies as people were coming in and out. My mother was like, no. You want to be a Girl Scout, you're going to do it like the right way. And I was like, what does that even mean? So anyway, they got me a walkie-talkie. And I had like some social anxiety. I know it probably doesn't seem like it now, but I do get very like nervous talking to people I don't know that well. And at 5 years old, it's even worse. And so anyway, Mom, which she forgot this story, I had to fight with her to remember it. She sent me out in the neighborhood with a walkie-talkie to go door to door and try to sell cookies. Only I had waited so long that everybody had bought the cookies, so I made it all around Vincent Road. And I came back and no one bought my cookies, and so I didn't make it. I didn't. And guess what? I survived.
Yeah, you survived.
I survived.
I mean, I guess that's definitely the point. But it's also your parents, like you talked about activism when you were young, but like it was really at the University of Vermont. You mentioned an incident where you used your voice, but more so you actually used your body, Alyssa, to like stop Speaker Gingrich from trying to talk about the Contract for America.
Who remembers the Contract for America? It was really bad. And I had just made new friends. And we're talking like at UVM, especially back in the 90s, it was like thinking back on it, it was crazy. Like Howard Dean was running for governor. He went dorm to dorm to get us to vote, to register us to vote. Bernie Sanders was up for re-election. Bernie went dorm to dorm to get people to vote. And I was like, and the girls and I were all like, and they said there was no opportunity up here in Burlington. It's true. We had all been rejected from schools like this. But we found safe haven in Vermont. And so I thought that it was wonderful, and my friends were all like, we have to change things, and we all had like US out of my uterus stickers, and so we got really like juiced up about the Contract for America, and Newt Gingrich was coming, and we're like, we're gonna go protest, and somehow, I guess because I'm short and I can never see anything, I was like in the front of the group, and I ended up on the hood of his car. But like, I have a steel trap memory. I only remember that. I don't remember how I got home. I don't remember if we had turkey sandwiches with honey mustard that night for dinner like we usually did. Like, that's all I remember. I was just on the hood of his car, and it felt good.
Well, we all appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, it really stopped things.
But it was also there at the university where you started an internship with Bernie Sanders, and that really kind of helped you figure out where you wanted to go and what you wanted to do, right?
I would just like to say that in my life, I've worked for Bernie, John Kerry, and Barack Obama. I'm just, the pundits on Meet the Press, I don't know why they don't have me on more, because clearly I'm a visionary. So Bernie, he was so present in Vermont. He was always in the news. He was always in the paper. And because it was all pre-internet, like I read the Burlington Free Press. And was like pretty aware of what was happening. I also took like rural sociology and I knew a lot about Vermont. And so I wanted to live in Burlington for the summer, and my parents were like, with what jobs? And so I got some jobs, and I actually applied to be an intern for Bernie. And it was the most amazing, this is what I loved about public service, and it was much more public service than politics, is that I answered the phones. I was the intern who answered the phones 6 hours a day, and I loved it. People would call, and it was like, well, because people think government doesn't work, right? But when you're in the district office of a congressman and someone calls you with an immigration problem, with a healthcare problem, with some potholes, I'm like, you should call Mayor Welch. But like there was actually like back then it felt there was much more immediacy. Like things changed, you got things fixed, you could help things, and so I became so obsessed with that then his outreach, his constituent coordinator was also his campaign manager, off hours, did not like, no double dipping. He's like, why don't you come down and work on the campaign? And so I did Congress by day, I did campaign by night, I drove Bernie, I was one of Bernie's drivers, and he always read the paper, and so I had to, like, if he got in the car and asked you what was happening with the gangs in Rutledge, like, you're Rutland, you better know, and I always did, and so he's like
you couldn't Google it back then, right?
Couldn't Google it. There was no like news Vermont top stories. No, like you really had to like go pretty deep, and it was not lost on him that I always did know those things. So at the end of that summer, they said, without making me go through the rigmarole, they invited me to come to Washington the next summer, which was a completely different experience. Like in Vermont, it's like super granola, and everyone's like, let's make the world better. And in DC, I mean, Lord have mercy, it was like, somehow I felt like every intern was a white Southern man. Don't know why, but like 80% of them were. And Bernie just like gave you all of this responsibility. And so one of my first jobs, which I don't think they do anymore, is that if Bernie was co-sponsoring legislation, I had to take the actual legislation to each office to get it signed. I was so thin that summer. I was so thin. And I loved it, but it was very intimidating to me. I felt a bit out of my depth. Like I didn't love DC. I felt like everybody was trying to be somebody. And in Vermont, everybody was just trying to help everybody. But still loved it, was committed, decided, and this is one of the things that I talk about all the time, like no job is too small. So when I answered the phones in Burlington, it wasn't so far back that the number didn't come up. The number comes up, and it's a 608 area code, which is Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I was transferring to the following month. And because in the weird circle of life, I was at the University of Vermont as a French major with a minor in Japanese, and I was transferring because they were getting rid of French as a major. And so I decided to go to Madison, Wisconsin and be a French major with a minor in Japanese. Only at the end of that summer, I was changing my major to political science. And when I sat there and the 608 area code comes up, I was very chatty. And I was like, hello. And he said, oh, this is Ed Garvey. I'm calling Bernie back. And I was like, oh, Bernie's just wrapping up a meeting. Would you like to hold? And he was like, sure. What are you up to? And so I end up engaging this man in conversation. And it turns out that Ed Garvey was the man who unionized the NFL Players Association. And was a huge activist, one of the first progressives. And he said, when you get out to Wisconsin, you might need a job, so call me. And I worked for Ed, may he rest in peace. He passed away a few years ago. He ran for governor a couple times. I worked for him for 2 years, and that is how I paid when I got arrested for getting a fake ID. I was like, Ed, I know this is not what you do, but I think I'm in some trouble. And he's like, ask for a payment plan and we'll figure it out. And so that is, I'm sure he put his skills to great use that day.
Well, this is why I love you, Alyssa, because you're so self-aware.
I'm self-aware.
So let me ask you, because I think one of the most compelling examples, like in the book, but we've talked about this, is there was an incident where something happened with the senior staff, and there was an email that went around, and you decided to react to it, and probably a little hot, probably justified.
I was really
But
mad.
it got back to the president, right?
It
President
did.
Obama.
Narcs.
And he actually said to you that you needed to realize the power of your words.
Yes.
So what did he mean by that?
So, a little backstory about what happened. You know, like now it seems so commonplace that people leak, right? Out of the White House, that everybody's just like yakking to reporters all day and like spilling state secrets. This was not something the Obama White House did. It's really not something any White House previously has done. And so when an article came out, a new chief of staff was incoming. And who was it? Jack Lew. Jack Lew was about to be chief of staff. And someone in the White House had talked about whether Nancy Ann and I would remain on as deputy chiefs, or if they would look for something. It was very pejorative. I can't remember what the word was. And whoever it was described my responsibilities in the West Wing as much less than they were. And I lost my mind. And I read it, and, you know, it comes around in the press clips, you know, and Dan Pfeiffer, who I'm sure you all know, I call him my platonic life partner, he sends this clip around to everyone, and he said the next day after this all unfolded, he's like, buddy, I should have called you. I should have called you and given you a heads up. And so what happened is I read the article, and I replied to about 20 members of the most senior people in the West Wing, and basically called them assholes, and said what bullshit it was, that they would like stab someone in the back and go to a reporter, and like I just said my piece. And the best is, there was real sisterhood in the White House. So Kathy Rumler, who was the president's lawyer, she doubled down for me. She's like, this is appalling. And so they were like, oh no, the women are mad. No, literally, because the next day I'm sitting at my desk and I feel free. I'm like, I've gotten this off my chest. People know how I feel. It'll never happen again. I'm sitting at my desk. Anita Decker, who was the personal aide at the time, who sat outside the Oval, she's like, hey, dude, POTUS just wants to see you real quick. And I was like, oh, that's weird, okay. And I go down to his office, and he's like, hey, you. I was like, oh, no. The hey, you meant one of two things. Like, either he loved you or you were in trouble. And I felt no reason that I was being loved at this point. And so he's like, I heard there was an email. And I just went silent. I stared down at the floor. He goes, stop trying to figure out who told me. And I was like, okay, fine. And then I sat there. He's like, I said focus. Stop trying to figure out who told me. And he said, you know, I need you to understand something. I know I have seen you for years. Mm-hmm. I know that I think you're a kid. I know you think these people think you're a kid. No one thinks you're a fucking kid but you. And so stop acting that way. Your words have power. And you cannot just go say things like that because it freaks everybody out. I'm like, yeah, a bunch of pussies. I mean, like, who's got to run to POTUS? And I found out it wasn't even one person. It was like 3 people. I was like, you guys. But after that, one, I am very selective about my reply alls, which we should all be. Yeah. Yeah, maybe that'll come out someday and I'll be able to see who forwarded him the email.
Be our mission. So I found in your acknowledgments, I found something interesting. Actually, I found a couple of things interesting when I'm not in them. So
sorry, girl.
That seemed, you know, it was probably, we'll talk about that later. It's probably just not enough space or something, you know, but it's fine. But one of the acknowledgments, you thanked Tina Chen and Valerie Jarrett for showing you how to be a woman in the White House.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
T. Chen, I don't know if, do you guys, Tina was the First Lady's chief of staff. She started out in the Office of Public, it was OPL, Office of Public Liaison. I always forgot what we changed the name to. And they would see me sometimes, and I would be wanting to make a point, or I'd be wanting to say something, and they would, now, we did not have BlackBerries as omnipresent as the iPhones in this place are. Yeah. In this West Wing, I mean, they're all just like literally like WhatsApping with, you know, Saudi royals from this West Wing. But every now and again, they could tell either Tina or VJ would know that they could see my wheels turning, and I would look down at my phone and it would just say it. And I was like, and I'd look at her, she'd be, And I was like, okay. And then I would say it. Yeah. And so because, like I said, I was younger, and I say this in no way, but when, and I've said it to Nancy Ann, so I know she's not going to kill me, but when Nancy Ann and I were both promoted simultaneously to deputy chief, Nancy Ann was almost 20 years older than me. And so I went to her and I was like, Nancy Ann, I need you to know that I don't think we're equals. You know, like, I know that you have more experience. And she's like, I don't have more experience doing what you do. And I was like, but she's like, nope, that's not how it is. And so that was like a real, Nancy Ann was also someone who really kicked my butt when it needed to be kicked because I was insecure. I mean, it's like, you have so much responsibility and you don't want to mess it up. And so
when you're told you're the first at something.
Yeah, you're the first, you're blazing trails.
Right.
But they really would be the ones who'd be like, say it, do it. No, Alyssa should go. I mean, like, I would end up on manifests for foreign leader meetings, and I approve them. I'm like, how did I end up on this? And VJ was like, you're going. It's the Germans. You're German. You're going to go. And I was like, okay. Which is how I met the Pope, because I tried desperately to not meet the Pope, but that is how. Sometimes because the other thing is when you're the person in charge of giving people access to things, you can be like an asshole and always take care of yourself first, or you can be a martyr like me and never put yourself on anything, which was my MO.
But it's interesting because those women really helped you in that situation. And you mentioned that you wrote this book really for young women to know there's a place if you want to work in government or public service.
There's a place everywhere. You know, it's just like, I think that we're getting to a point where we see, you know, people want to go into jobs and be in places where they see themselves reflected in the leadership, right? And it's still a ways to go for women. Like we were talking, most major investment banks, by the time you get to the managing director level, they're 80% are men. And it's because women don't see themselves in the leadership. It's like, I always tell my friends, like, dating begets dating. Like, just go on a date. You'll get another date from it. But that's kind of the way it is in the workforce, too. It's like success begets success. And so that's why I always try to, like, pick unconventional people. Because you know what? If Barack Obama had not been unconventional, I never would have sat in that office next to the Oval Office. And he wouldn't have given me the responsibility that he gave me. I mean, he sat there and looked at me when we were on a Black Hawk in Afghanistan, and he's like, what's the plan, ma'am? And I had the plan. I was the one, we're gonna land in Karzai's palace, and it's gonna be dark, and, you know, like, and that was the time talking about preparedness.
Yeah.
They were all like, what is in your pockets? I was like, nothing, what do you mean? They're like, what, Alyssa, what is going on? And like, why is your jacket so puffy? And so I had dressed, like most of the men wore suits, but I'm like, I'm not gonna wear a suit. So I had like, you know, like a cargo jacket on, cute with like a little belt, and some green pants. And I thought I was like Hot Lips Houlihan from MASH. And I had never been on a Black Hawk before, and I was afraid I was gonna throw up. And so instead of wanting to throw up on Axe, Gibbs, I was the only woman on the Black Hawk. Axe, Gibbs, like Rhodes, like you name it, all these guys, McDonough. I was like, if I'm gonna barf, I'm gonna do it with dignity. And so I had the plastic bags, and Axelrod was like, I hope you're planning on sharing, because like, why do you think I'm not gonna barf? And I was like, oh, that's a good plan. I just didn't want to be like the woman that barfed on the Black Hawk. And he was like, so it was very, those were the days.
But you have these amazing moments, amazing stories at the White House. I think one of the toughest lessons in life is knowing when to leave a situation, whether it's a job or a relationship. How did you grapple and know you were ready to leave the White House?
So, you really start losing any and all creativity. And like the person that, like anyone who's been on a campaign and you make it through, and then they bring in the big guns, the people who have done like 10 campaigns before you, and somehow they're smarter or better because they just tell you that every idea you have is terrible and has been done before and didn't work. That is who I was becoming. And I had been with Barack Obama so long, I had been in every situation you could possibly imagine. It's like tornado, flood, like mass shootings. I mean, like you name it, I had been there. And so when John Podesta was coming back to the White House, our White House, at first I was like, John Podesta, what do we need him for? Why do we have to bring in a retread? And I know that this is being taped, so there's a punchline to the story. And so we were sitting there the first day, and he comes in, sprightly as you can imagine. Hey gang, anyone I don't know, John Podesta, sits down at the table, and we were talking about I forget. It was probably some infrastructure event. That's always what it comes down to. And
Yeah.
trying to make an infrastructure event interesting and something that the Secret Service will also let you do in a post 9/11 world. And I literally had my head down on the desk, and Podesta was like, "What about this?" And I was like, "John, I'm so glad you're here. It's really nice you have new ideas." And so whereas I wanted to be like, this is who we are, and we're the Obama people, and we don't need anybody, we needed other people. And there's a time when I had gotten everything I was probably going to get out of that job, and I was tired. Like, my body was falling apart. I had teeth problems. I had gastrointestinal problems. I just, I was just mad. I was getting mad all the time. So I finally decided, I went to POTUS before Christmas in 13, and I said, "Sir, when we come back from the holidays, like, let's talk about my departure." And he was like, "You just need a vacation. You just need a vacation. It'll be fine." And I can't remember what terrible thing happened in the ensuing 3 weeks that, like, definitely meant I wasn't getting a vacation. But then I came back and I said, "Sir, like, someone else deserves to have this opportunity and have the experiences that I've had. And I'm used to operating at 110%, and I'm operating at 95. And for some people that may be enough, but it's not enough for the West Wing." And so I left. But it was really hard. I cried. I was gonna say, Dan Pfeiffer and I had been together for so long. I mean, like, the people talk about, like, the Obama bros. I was, like, kind of a bro. And John Favreau, who I'm sure you guys all know, Favreau and I had worked together since the day he graduated college until the day he left the White House. And Pfeiffer and I had been through so much of life together that I said that when the day I left, it was like Brenda and Brandon saying goodbye on 90210 when she went away to Minnesota for college. I was like, it's just like, and like, I couldn't handle what was happening. And so they take your badge. That's the final thing. The people who didn't give Jared Kushner clearance, those people, they come back and they repossess your badge. And so you have to fill out all these forms. It's called being read out, basically saying you're never going to share the classified information that you've learned. And this lovely security military man is sitting across from me, and I'm sobbing. I'm like, "I'm sure this happens all the time." And he was like, "Not once ever." I was like, "Okay." And so, like, to occupy my final few hours in the West Wing, it's like, it's like life goes on without you. The government has to function without you. No person is integral to how things happen. And so I needed to be so useful that while Dan was taking my office when I left, that while he was in a meeting, I got all of the interior decorator people I took all the things out of his office and put them in my office. And when he came back, he's like, "Oh, buddy, we're going to have to talk about this. May need some therapy. Like, what are you doing?" But it was my way. It was like my peace offering. I'm like, if I don't do it, you're never going to do it. And that was our goodbye.
Goodbye.
That was so many tears.
So many tears.
So many tears.
I have to ask you, because this past week has been a real challenging one for this country. But you made a point in your book of saying that kindness really means something. And I think with this
empathy
week,
too.
Yeah, I'd love you to expand a little more on that, because I think during your tenure you've seen so much recently.
I have. So like, I'm just going to preface this with, like, don't anybody get upset, but, like, I can't talk about this without choking up sometimes, but, like, don't feel bad for me. I'm okay. So the thing that you realize when you come into office, for us, it was the Bush folks. Mm-hmm. I truly believe that when you enter those 18 acres of the White House campus, that in so many ways partisanship melts away, at least if you're in, like, the President's Club, right? And so our very first days back in DC, when we were on the transition getting into the White House, the Bush folks, we were so scared. I mean, you don't know what the hell. You literally have no idea what's going to happen. And they said, you know what? They hosted these briefings for us. They updated these binders. Like, anything you could have had a question on, they had a binder for. And just seeing that those binders were waiting for us, we were like, okay, like, that's a little bit of something. Yeah. So our last transition meeting that we were going to, my deputy, Danielle Crutchfield, and I, Dee Dee, I call her, we go to the Secret Service gate for our meeting, and they're like, "Nope, sorry, ladies, your meeting's actually in the West Wing." And we're like, no. we're going to the EEOB. And they're like, no, ma'am. Like, they didn't think we were adorable at all. They're like, go to the other gate. And so we did. And the guy says, oh, you're going to be heading to the West Wing reception. You have a meeting with the chief of staff. And she's very tall. Dee Dee is much like a foot taller than me, and she's an African-American woman, and I was little white Rose and she was big black Rose, and that's how we went through life. And we were so scared and so fat from the campaign that our clothes did not fit properly. So we were literally like shuffling down West Exec trying to not blow a seam. And we're being funny, we're like, God, all those mornings with like extra meat on the Jaffa Bagel in Chicago is really coming home to roost right now. And we get to and we're just sitting in the West lobby, and there are these Norman Rockwell paintings, which I understand Trump has moved, but and they show Norman Rockwell sat in the West Wing lobby for a week, and he did a series of paintings, and they are of all the different kinds of people who come in, the postman and the foreign leader and all this. So we're sitting there, and it's Christmas time, and we're like, look at the tree, and she's like, don't touch it, it'll fall over. And so what had happened was Josh Bolton had decided that he wanted to welcome everybody properly. And so he invited Dee Dee and I to meet with him and ask any questions we had. And then at the end, he said, we have something we want to do for you. When you get to the White House, you will understand the holidays are terrible. And you are never going to like Christmas. You are going to hate Christmas. And you're never going to appreciate the magic of this campus when you work here, because people are just going to be up your butt, like asking for tickets to things. And so they gave us a personal guided tour of all the Christmas decorations and of the East Wing and things that we would never have enjoyed. And so that's kindness. Like, they didn't want us to fail. They wanted us to succeed, because the government, that's what it's about. Like I sound like President Bartlett from the West Wing, but the peaceful transition of power in our government is one of the most special things about us. And so we said, and we made a commitment then and there, we would never do less than they did for us, for anybody. And so in 2012, it was Mitt Romney was running. We didn't know if we were going to win, and so we updated all the binders, and we reached out to the Romney team, and we're like, would you like to submit your clearances? And they were all like, psst, psst. And then luckily I had it all in email, because Benghazi happened, and they wanted briefings, and they didn't have their clearance, and they tried to say that we were holding it up, when I was like, dudes, like, check your inbox. I sent this to you 2 months ago. But regardless, even when President Trump came, like, we always wanted to leave the government better than we found it. That is, like, if you go on my Instagram account, it says always leave it better than you found it. And I think that that's something I believed. It's a real thing from advance. When you're doing advance on trips, you always want to leave a town better than you found it, not leave it worse. But carrying that forward into just things that we did, and it's something that is so, look, elections have consequences. I do not begrudge Donald Trump being president. He won. But it is the lack of humanity. Like, you know, I always say when people ask me questions about, you know, what do you think, when do you think the chickens will come home to roost kind of thing? I was like, the utter chaos in that West Wing will be revealed, because when real crisis happens, which we have found they just ignore largely. But when real crisis happens, if you don't know your exact role and responsibility, it's a shit show. So we never had a problem. We really never did. Fukushima starts to melt down. Guess what? There's a phone tree. Sit room calls me, Alyssa, there's a situation in Japan. They brief me on it. I decide whether it goes to the chief or whether it goes straight to the president. I was like, we're going to send this one straight to POTUS. And then I call the chief and I brief him. When the Boston bombing happened, okay, we all watched it unfold just like everybody else did in real time. There could have been people running around like chickens without heads, but it wasn't. It was Bob Mueller, it was John Brennan, and it was me, and it was Janet Napolitano. And we're like, who's going to go talk to who? We came back. We sit in the Oval Office with the president. Reason I love Bob Mueller, this happened several times. There's nobody I respect more. I mean, he is just like he's the be all end all. And when we would get into the Oval Office and Obama would look at him and be like, all right, Bob, give it to me. He's like, actually, sir, I'm going to have Alyssa kick off the meeting because she has the most recent information on X, Y, and Z. And so talk about someone who lifts up women. But in those times, it was we knew what we were doing, we knew who we had to talk to, we knew who did what, and guess what? If you weren't part of the response team, like if you weren't in it, you just did your work, because the government still has to go on. And that, of course, the problem, but the lack of empathy, I was the one who got the call about what was happening in Newtown, which is also why I wish the media would calm down a bit, because if things had been as frenzied as they were now, if they had been back then, the reports that we got starting at, in the morning through early afternoon iterated every hour. The first phone call I got said there might be a mall shooting in Connecticut. That was the first information. And so that's why I try to be a good social media citizen. I wish everybody would. I always try to check my articles and my facts before I retweet them or say anything about them. But with what happened this week, I really fundamentally don't understand how the decision-making happens. I don't see that John Kelly would abide by, I don't believe that John Kelly would abide by having a political rally the day of a mass shooting. That is like a no-brainer. That is like not a partisan decision. That's decorum, that's empathy, and that is the saddest thing about what's happening now. And just back to the kindness point, we followed Barack Obama's example. He did not surround himself with assholes, so there wasn't like a huge, delta for us to sort of be who he was. But that day, December 14th of Newtown, when we understood exactly what had happened, it was Christmas. And he said, Alyssa, stay back. And everybody went to go do their thing, and he's like, there are people in the East Room who came here to see the White House at Christmas. And I said, yeah. And he goes, and some of those people, Alyssa, they saved up all year to be able to come here. I have to go talk to them. And I said, okay. And he's like, I just need a couple minutes. And he went over and he said to them, he's like, I'm sorry that this happened to you on this day when this was here. And they were all like, oh my God, like you don't have to. But like there are just ways to do things. And you know what? I believe Barack Obama is a special person. I think George Bush would have handled it the same way. I know Bill Clinton would have handled it the same way. Like and that's where I say like kindness and empathy are not partisan, and that's what makes me so sad about our current situation in Washington.
Well, can we thank Alyssa for sharing?
You're welcome. Sorry, I told you I got a little for clown.
No, hey, thank you. Thanks for sharing it. I think I'm sure a lot of you have questions for Alyssa, so we have time for a couple questions. So, I think we're going to have some people help us. Guys,
don't give me low self-esteem by not having questions.
I know you do.
Really? No one?
Oh, there's one right over here.
Hi,
Alyssa.
I was wondering what you think about, I think 28 of the required 34 states have approved an Article 5 constitutional convention, which is basically the overhaul of I'm sure you know.
No, keep going.
Can we I'm sorry, I should have told everybody, we'd love to have you get up to the microphone so everybody can hear your question, because I think it's a good one.
Yeah, seriously. We have to group think this one a little.
So 28 of the required 34 states have approved an Article 5 constitutional convention, which would basically call for an overhaul of the Constitution. So I was just wondering what you thought about that.
So I wouldn't really go there right now, because I don't think that I think that we need to be of our better angels to do something like that. Like, of course, things need to be overhauled. Of course, there are things that are sort of like obsolete-ish at this point. But to do it right now, I think would be catastrophic, in my opinion. I think that the Constitution is something that, transcends, and I don't think that anyone's capable of that right now. I really don't.
Thank you.
There's one over here for you.
Hi.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. My name is Jackson Grigsby. I'm a junior
Very
at the
tall,
college.
Jackson.
Yeah. But I really valued your comments about empathy and compassion. And just could you elaborate on how you think we can bring that back into American politics and how we can kind of mend all of these, these tragedies and these kind of this rift between Americans?
So, every time something like this happens, you're like, wow, is this rock bottom? You're like, it's probably not rock bottom. There's probably something worse that's going to happen. I think that in as much as people can. You know, an interesting thing, a couple weeks ago, I was in Iowa, right? And there are very different kinds of candidates that are running in Iowa right now. And they are running as Democrats, but they're really quite moderate. And I think that we need to give people the space to really represent their constituencies and not pledge allegiance to some, you know, to the rabid fringe of each party, which is like where both of them kind of are right now, right? It's like if you're not for abolishing ICE, you know, you're not a Democrat. And if you're not for God knows what, you know, you're not a Republican. And that's not really, to me, what it is. You know, like when we ran against a couple things, if you go back to, and there was a lot of controversy online about this a bit, but if you go back to when Barack Obama ran against John McCain, and when things were getting like, you know, by those standards back then, we're like, whoa, this is heated. Now it's like, that was, you know, like Candyland. And John McCain was like, no, that's not how I want to win. I don't want to win by like race baiting and doing all this stuff. Like, that's not how I want to become president. And one of the most, which I rewatched a bunch of times when he passed, one of the best speeches politically ever that you could watch is John McCain's concession speech. And it's not because we won. That is not why. Because I would say John Kerry's concession speech was probably one of the best speeches that he ever gave here at Faneuil Hall. And but he brought people together, right? And because of that, aside from Mitch McConnell, who we could just like send to Mars, people were like, let's give this man a chance. John McCain called for people to let Barack Obama become president and like have a chance. And so for me, I think in as much as young people, like I'm not sure what we can do for the old people. Like all you have to do is watch that Kavanaugh hearing and you could utterly lose faith in America. But I think as much as young people can learn again to how to disagree without being disagreeable, and just because you don't agree with someone doesn't mean they're bad, just means they're different. And to me, that's like, I try to do that, and I try to, in as much as possible, put myself in other people's shoes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Take one from over here.
Oh, hi.
Hi, I'm Renee.
Hi,
I'm a
Renee.
junior at the college. First, I just want to say thank you for always keeping it real, whether it's in Hysteria or your book.
I try.
But speaking of your book, you mentioned this ageism that you experienced much more than sexism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, as a young woman wanting to go into politics, what like practical advice would you have for me to navigate those probable biases I will encounter?
So I would tell you to not actually worry about it. When I write about the ageism, it's more like what was happening in my head, you know? And so it's like the things I was putting on myself and the things I was reading into situations a little bit more. But like, for example, you just have to, this is gonna sound, you guys are gonna roll your eyes. You just literally have to be the best you that you can be, because that's really all that it takes. Like, I didn't have to be anybody different to get the members of the military office to respect me. I had to stop telling myself I didn't deserve to be at that table. That was where I needed to start. And then once I got there, they treated me no differently. I didn't dress differently. I mean, I thought about it. I was like, maybe I shouldn't wear like Care Bear shirts to the Situation Room anymore. Especially when there are like pictures. Like Pete Souza used to do a book for us at the end of every year. And Pfeiffer was like, is there one picture you're not wearing hearts in? Which is weird because I'm like not super feminine. But it was like, it's where Kate Spade was at those years. Rest in peace, Kate Spade. But that's the thing. I actually wouldn't, you come from here. I mean, for God's sake, I was like a mediocre student from Vermont and Wisconsin, but I just wouldn't. You do you will be great. That was what I put on myself. And I was also thrust into a situation with people who had done all of this before and who were like, to me, my respect for the military was so off the charts that they were really the ones I was like, they don't have to respect me at all. But they didn't think of it that way. And so just don't put that on yourself.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hey.
Hi, thank you so much for being here.
Sure. I can hear you.
Great. So my name is Dina Montemorano. Our last names rhyme, so we should be
do.
friends.
So unusual, so many vowels in the same room.
I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. I'm feeling pretty pessimistic about the future of reproductive health rights in America right now. I really enjoy your updates on Hysteria, your Uterus Weekly.
Yeah, Uterus Weekly. Tune in.
So I would love to hear a little bit about what is happening right now with advocates, whether it's at the local or state level, and what needs to be happening happening in order to guard against future national threats to our reproductive health rights.
So it's not good for anybody who doesn't know this yet. You know, Kavanaugh is the vote that can overturn Roe if that comes to the courts. Cases are being put forward faster than they would have been before. I actually quit my job at Lifetime TV for Women, which was part of A&E, to be a super volunteer for NARAL Pro-Choice America. Those organizers are everywhere, and they're educating people. And the biggest problem is that, you know, most of us don't know a world without Roe, right? And people take it for granted. And when they say it can be overturned, I've been at a lot of like events with younger women, and one of the events I went in, they didn't know who Gloria Steinem was. And I was like, well, so that's where we need to start. It's not great. But the thing that I would tell people to really focus on and learn in your states, which was one of my better moments at Radio City Music Hall with Pod Save America, I gave a tutorial on trigger laws. How many people know what a trigger law is? Okay, everyone needs to go home and Google trigger laws and find out if the state where you live, Massachusetts, is actually in good shape. But if where you come from has a trigger law, and what a trigger law is, and you'd be surprised, I think it is, don't quote me, it is upwards of 33 states that have trigger laws. So if Roe were to be overturned, abortion would become immediately illegal in those states. And so putting pressure, one of the things that was, New York was actually not in great shape. And Cynthia Nixon running against Cuomo in the primary, she got that out there. Like she drilled that home. And so now he has, I forget exactly what he did, but we're in better shape in New York. But the governors and your local electeds are so much more important now than ever. They're the ones, like the clinics, there's one clinic left in Texas. I mean, it's so much worse than people realize. And the law and the truth is that it's not likely that one day we're going to wake up and Roe's just going to be overturned. They're going to continue to chip away at things, saying that if you perform an abortion in this location, it needs to be like a hospital and the doors need to be this wide. And like it's garbage that like we can't keep up with on a regular basis. And so I would say that the most important thing you can do is follow at NARAL, because they are doing the most education, especially at a state level, for what needs to happen. Yeah, but it's not good.
Thank you. Yeah.
This will be our last question.
Okay,
tonight,
hi.
so.
Hi, my name is Kyra. I'm not a student. I am a public servant. I first want to say thank you for your service. I know what a sacrifice it is. And I've been a scientist with the Environmental Protection Agency here in Boston for 21 years. And I wanted your advice on, for public servants, both current and future public servants that may face an administration like this and the challenge, and just to inspire us and remind us how we can survive in untenable times.
I'm going to tell you what Barack Obama told me when I asked him the same question. And he said, America is stronger than one man. Now, I believe that. It's hard on the day-to-day. I mean, when the last time I went back to Washington, D.C., and I drove by the State Department, which at 6 o'clock in the morning, the parking lot used to be full, and it's not what it used to be. But the thing to remember as a public servant is that you're not serving Donald Trump, you're serving the people. And it's really hard, and it can be demoralizing, but like in some ways, I'm like, God, do I need to go back into public service? Because I feel like we kind of have to lead by example. But don't give up, because the people, think of all of the thing that I think about Donald Trump that's such a fucking bummer is that the whole point of government is to protect the weakest among us. And that is the exact opposite of what he is doing. And so you have to do it. We have to do it, because he's not going to do it. And we have to make sure, don't worry, I'm not crying, I have an eyelash. We have to make sure.
It's very emotional.
It's very emotional. We need to make sure that we don't lose these wonderful people. I mean, when we talk about the continuity of government and transitioning, it is because of career employees in the federal government that people know the history of what's happened in Somalia, that we understand the relationship with France, that you understand the implications of why you go to Japan on your way to China. That now people just have to Google because they don't even use the public servants and the deep, rich resources that they have. So you have to remember that you are a deep, rich resource.
And we're not leaving, we're just suffering.
Yes, I know. Just
thank you.
Sorry. I know.
Thanks so much.
No, but it's a great place to I think, end tonight. I mean, there's so much, especially happening at the Institute of Politics, to talk about and make sure young people know the importance of public service. So I want to encourage everybody, if you haven't read this book, please get it. It's phenomenal.
It's a hoot.
It's a lot of fun. And follow Alyssa on Twitter. It is one of my favorite things to do.
You can tell how dark it is in the world by how many pictures I tweet of my cats.
Yes, it's a clear.
If it's like
a clear
a
indicator.
3-cat day, you just stay in bed.
It's a clear indicator. But we appreciate you using your voice, especially because you've been such a strong public servant in these tough times. And I thank you for being
thank you for coming.
a great friend, even though, well, maybe next book.
Think of it as a tribute to you.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you. I love it. Thank you all for being here. We really
Thank you,
appreciate your
guys.
time. Thank you, Alyssa. Nicely done.
We're done. All right.